Reading What is Cinema? Question mark. Essay selected and translated by Hugh Gray by Andre Bazin. Foreword by Jean Renoir. In the days when kings were kings, when they washed the feet of the poor and, by the simple act of passing by, healed those afflicted with scophilia, there were poets to confirm their belief in their greatness. Not infrequently the singer was greater than the object of his singing. This is where Bazin stands vis-a-vis the cinema. But that part of the story has to do only with what lies ahead. What is going on now is simply the assembling of materials. Civilization is but a sieve through the holes of which there passes the discard. The good remains. I am convinced that in Villain's day poets abounded on the banks of the Seine, or of the Seine. Where are they now? Question mark. Who are they? Question mark. No one knows, but Villain is there still, large as life. Our children and our grandchildren will have an invaluable source of help in sorting through the remains of the past. They will have Bazin alongside them. For that king of our time, the cinema, has likewise its poet, a modest fellow, sickly, slowly, and prematurely dying. He it was who gave the patent of royalty to the cinema, just as the poets of the past had crowned their kings. That king on whose brow he has placed a crown of glory is all the greater for having been stripped by him of the falsely glittering robes that hampered its progress. It is, thanks to him, a royal personage rendered healthy, cleansed of its parasites, fined down, a king of quality, that our grandchildren will delight to come upon. And in that same moment they will also discover its poet. They will discover Andre Bazin discovered too, as I have discovered, that only too often the singer has once more risen above the object of his song. There is no doubt about the influence that Bazin will have in the years to come. His writings will survive even if the cinema does not. Perhaps future generations will only know of its existence through his writings. Men will try to imagine a screen with horses galloping across it, a close-up of a beautiful star, or the rolling eye of a dying hero, and each will interpret these things in his own way, but they will agree on one thing, namely the high quality of what is cinema? Question mark. This will be true even should these pages, saved from the wreckage, speak to us only of an art that is gone, just as archaeological remains bring to light the objects of cults that are incapable any longer of imagining. There is, then, no doubt as to Bazin's influence on the future. Let me say, however, that it is for his influence on his contemporaries that I hold him so deep in my affections. He made us feel that our trade was a noble one, much in the same way that the saints of old persuaded the slave of the value of his humanity. It is our good fortune to have Hugh Gray as the translator of these essays. It was a difficult task. Hugh Gray solved the problem by allowing himself to become immersed in Bazin, something that called for considerable strength of personality. Luckily, alike for the translator, for the author, and for us, Bazin and Gray belong to the same spiritual family. Through the pages that follow, they invite us to become its adopted children. And that was the foreword. Now forward to the 2004 edition by Dudley Andrew. In the touching foreword with which Jazmine R graced this translation of what is cinema, 35 years ago, he conjures up civilization's murky past and its murkier future. When history has had its devastating way, he writes, when noisy people, problems, and events have eroded and passed through the, quote, sieve, end quote, of our memory into oblivion, there will still remain those rock-hard formulations of great poets which outlast even the subjects that occasioned their verse. Bazin's essays are such gems. Bazin is indeed cinema's poet laureate, or better, its griot. Full of praise poems and aphorisms, his essays emblazon cinema's history and its possibilities in lapidary language that remains unmatched in both precision and luminescence. Yet Bazin would have laughed at this precious genealogical metaphor as his preface to Qu'est-ce que la cinema, makes clear. The bulk of what he had produced came out in newspapers and pamphlets, he said, useful mainly to fuel the fireplace. Quote, the history of criticism being already such a minor thing, that of a particular critic ought to interest no one, certainly not the critic himself, except as an exercise in humility, end quote. Yet, in the last year of his life, he sifted through the nearly 3,000 items he had written for publication in order to find those key pieces, 65 of them, that signaled something larger than the particular exigency under which they were penned. Each selection addresses the question which, in homage to Sartre's great essay on literature, he posed as title to his four-part collection, quote, what is cinema, end quote. Was it this presumptuous title that tempted Glenn Gosling, an editor at the University of California Press, to envisage an English translation of Bazin, ? He had been looking to follow up Rudolf Arnheim's film as art, which he had brought out in 1957. Gosling worked out of the Los Angeles office where he often ran into Hugh Gray, who was on Film Quarterly's editorial staff. Gray had been a scriptwriter in both England and America before he began teaching aesthetics at UCLA, a position that included service with Film Quarterly. It was his knowledge of Bazin's writings and of Bazin's reputation in France that led to the project. A generation older than Bazin, Gray nevertheless shared his philosophical orientation, evident in the theological defense he makes in his introduction. An elegant conversationalist and stylist, he was sensitive to Bazin's clever prose, which he strove to deliver in graceful English. It's not clear how much of Bazin's original Gray proposed to include, but Gosling surely meant to keep the volume sleek, restricting it mainly to articles dealing with films familiar to Americans. They settled on 10 essays taken from the 25 that make up the first 2 of the 4 volumes Bazin had laid out. After surprisingly good sales, Gray was encouraged by Ernest Kallenbach to prepare What is Cinema? Volume 2. 16 more pieces selected from the 40 that comprised the last 2 volumes of the original French. While any excision may seem sacrilegious, Bazin's French publishers would in fact cut nearly the same amount when they brought out their single volume, quote, edition definitive, end quote, in 1981. His modesty notwithstanding, Bazin might well have bristled at the streamlining. In his own short preface, he justified the inclusion of brief pieces on forgotten short subjects like Death Every Afternoon and Gide, which Gray found expendable and are no longer to be found in the French collection. He claimed they serve as supporting stones to help bear the weighty theoretical edifice. Nor did he want to fold them into one of the longer essays, though, quote, evolution of the language of cinema, end quote, the virtues and limitations of montage, end quote, and, quote, cinema and painting, end quote, are indeed compilations. The idiosyncrasies and imperfections of some of the essays, he felt, are what give them character and, as is the case with concrete, a certain tensile strength. Here Bazin gives away his secret. He regards his own essays the way he feels a critic should treat films, elaborating their lofty narrative and thematic problems, yet attending sympathetically to the contingencies and impurities that made them fitting expressions in their historical moment. As a medium, cinema begs exactly such double vision. The nature of photography ties cinema's huge ambitions to historical and material circumstances. Thus, cinema shaped not only Bazin's thought about his vocation, but also his very manner of thinking. 2. No one understood this better than Eric Romer, who had prepared a brilliant review of Qu'est-ce que le cinéma? For Cahiers du Cinéma, only to see it published as a eulogy when it came out just weeks after Bazin's death, entitled, quote, Andre Bazin's, quote, Summa, end quote, end of quote. Romer's title invokes Thomas Aquinas, suggesting a magisterial command of a diverse set of questions, organized hierarchically and answered from first principles. Romer appeals to Bazin's organization of the four little tomes. Volume 1 treats cinema's internal life principles, its, quote, ontology, end quote, and its, quote, language, end quote. Volume 2 approaches cinema from the outside as a surveyor might, triangulating its situation on the cultural landscape amongst the other arts. Volume 3 turns to patently contextual issues, subtitled as it is, quote, Cinema and Sociology, end quote. Volume 4 is reserved for a case study of neorealism, the most important development in sound cinema, and a movement that ratified and contributed to his understanding of the medium. Romer insists that Bazin did not hastily impose this order from his deathbed, searching for the main threads of a life's output. Rather, he carried a lucid design with him throughout his career, a design that progressively expressed and clarified itself in contact with whatever history brought him. Serge Daney would vividly ratify this point. Block quote, bad cineastes have no ideas. Good cineastes have too many. But the great cineastes have just one idea. Such an obsessive idea stabilizes them on their way, yet guides them into ever new and interesting landscapes. And what about great critics? The same would hold true for them. If there were any, all critics fade in time except one. Between 1943 and 1958, Andre Bazin was that one. His idée fixe was to show that before signifying it or resembling it, cinema embalmed the real, end quote, or end of block quote. The hundreds of film reviews that Bazin patiently wrote year after year were animated by his fixation with cinema's specifically photographic capability. History thereby validated the coherence of a theoretical line, yet, and this is crucial, history also extended that line, for in the Sartrean vocabulary of those times, Bazin held that, quote, cinema's existence precedes its existence, end quote, because, quote, contingency is also a necessary quality of film, end quote. New films, no matter of what quality, led Bazin to new formulations about crucial features of the medium. Romer can make Bazin sound quite like Gilles Deleuze as a thinker obsessed with creating new concepts. Romer says, quote, the purpose of each new article is not to complete or clarify a thought that was partially expressed elsewhere or even to offer more convincing examples. Rather, it creates a new thought whose existence we had not suspected. It gives life to critical, quote, entities, end quote, just as the mathematician gives life to numbers or theorems, end quote. But where Deleuze would champion self-generating mathematical and filmic systems, Bazin, at least as Romer portrays him, unswervingly developed a realist system. Like, quote, Euclid's straight line, end quote, photographic reference serves as the system's first axiom. From it, the theorist may derive corollaries and far-flung hypotheses. Bazin formulated this principle as early as 1943, while first turning out movie reviews in a mimeographed student newsletter. 25 years old, rebounding from having just been blocked from teaching because of a stammer, he announced to his friends that he could foresee making a life writing about film. He aimed to produce a history and an aesthetic found on the social psychology of this popular medium. Where did Bazin acquire the inspiration and confidence to project a full-blown reorientation of film theory? ? He had as a model the, quote, little school of the spectator, end quote, that Roger Lienhart had composed in the 30s for Excerpt, the personalist journal that would soon disseminate Bazin's most prominent essays. Lienhart, a socially committed intellectual and cineast, claimed a realist aesthetic that Bazin found the only significant approach to modern, i.e. sound, cinema. It was to Lienhart and to Francois Truffaut that in 1958 Bazin dedicated his collected works, the first man representing his heritage, the second his legacy. Lienhart met Bazin frequently at the Ciné Club of the Maison des Lettres that Bazin helped found in 1942 near the Sorbonne. One of their discussions concerned Andre Malraux's, quote, sketch for a psychology of the cinema, end quote, which appeared in Verve's, quote, wartime issue, end quote, previewing the celebrated 1947 psychology of art. Bazin, who belonged to a Malraux study group at the Maison, was deeply taken with this dashing scholar, already a resistance legend. Just after the war, the two men jousted over the quote cinematic language end quote that Malraux developed in Esport, released in 1945, although finished in 1939. Malraux graciously conceded that Bazin provided by far, quote, the most ingenious and attentive, end quote, response to his film. Then there was Jean-Paul Sartre, another legend of the occupation years, who from time to time would show up clandestinely at Bazin Cine Club to see what else German silent films. Sartre's Being and Nothingness appeared at just this moment, but it was his earlier Psychology of the Imagination, 1940, with its phenomenology of painting and photography, that Bazin immediately bought and annotated. Although Bazin adopted from his intellectual heroes a set of concerns and style of thinking and writing, he seldom took up their positions. One can feel both Sartre and Malraux hovering at the borders of, quote, the ontology of the photographic image, end quote. Yet this magnificent essay is all Bazin. It is one of the most far-reaching and suggestive essays ever written on the image. His oeuvre can hardly be imagined without it. A pearl secreted within him throughout the occupation. The essay received a first chance at publication when in 1943 the art historian Gaston Dael commissioned Bazin to contribute to an ambitious special edition of Confluences called Les Problèmes de la Peinture. He was surely proud to be included alongside Cateau, Stein, Desnos, Rouault, Matisse, and Brock. And within the bravely leftist series Confluences that was struggling to make it through the war in Lyon. In fact, Bazin had a lot of time, perhaps as long as a year, to refine his contribution, since the publishing house that printed Confluences by day also brought out the resistance publication Témoignage Chrétien by night. 2 weeks before D-Day, the publishing office was raided by the Gestapo and its director sent off to his death. With the press shut down and with several of the projected contributions having gone into the active resistance, Dael and René Tavernier, editor of Confluences and father of filmmaker Bertrand Tavernier, determined to hold the issue till the war's end. By 1945, Bazin had honed his 8 pages to perfection and had started to elaborate their consequences. More than a gem to be admired, and more too than just a supporting stone, it became the cornerstone of his view of what cinema was and could be. And yet, quote, the ontology of the photographic image, end quote, behaves strangely as cinema's foundation. First of all, it concentrates on photography and seldom mentions cinema. The final, startling sentence about cinema, which mimics the conclusion of Malraux's, quote, sketch, end quote, was added by Bazin in 1958. Secondly, the essay's memorable opening deflects inquiry away from ontology to ontology's nemesis. Quote, if the plastic arts were put under psychoanalysis, the practice of embalming the dead might turn out to be a fundamental factor in their creation, end quote. Apparently, to understand, quote, what cinema is, end quote, at least in the milieu of Sartre, one must understand not the ontology so much as the psychology at play behind the experience of images, an experience that Malraux was just then demonstrating to be more cultural than personal. At one time, for instance, in ancient Egypt, human beings evidently believed in the ontological identity of model and image, but few in our Western culture believe this anymore. Images today are thought to serve symbolic and aesthetic functions, not magical ones. They signify what is important to culture, and they do so in styles that display values. Nevertheless, even sophisticated or decadent cultures have been fascinated by the possibility of duplicating appearances and thereby preserving what naturally decays in time. Hence Bazin's conclusion, quote, if the history of the plastic arts is less a matter of their aesthetic than of their psychology, then it will be seen to be essentially the story of resemblance, or, if you will, of realism, end quote. The invention of photography in the 19th century constitutes the, quote, more or most important event, end quote, in this history. A shift in the material ontological basis of images forced a reconfiguration of aesthetics and psychology in the ever variable, quote, balance between the symbolic and realism, end quote. The tension between these terms, which traditionally mark the limits of the functions of images, exists both in photography and in painting, but in different ratios. This tension also separates the two traditions that vie for dominance in Bazin's view of the evolution of the cinema. Between those filmmakers, quote, who put their faith in the image and those who put their faith in reality, end quote. Bazin is often prematurely accused of being a proponent of a realist style, but realism to him is not primarily a stylistic category. It is an automatic effect of photographic technology drawing on an irrational psychological desire. As he points out, for a long time after the birth of photography, oil painting remained superior in producing likenesses. Quote, a very faithful drawing may actually tell us more about the model, but it will never have the irrational power of the photograph to bear away our faith. Hence, the charm of family albums, end quote. The way an image comes into being, then, sways the way we take it in, so that in a psychological rather than a stylistic sense, photography, quote, satisfied our appetite for illusion by a mechanical reproduction in the making of which man plays no part, end quote. Exactly what Bazin thinks about this, quote, appetite for illusion, end quote, is debatable. The photograph recovers the fetish character that the image lost in Western culture years ago, by virtue of the impression of its unique pattern of reflected light on emulsion. The object photographed haunts the photo from which it is absent in both space and time. Bazin's marvelous litany of analogies flows easily from this intuition. The photograph as fingerprint, as holy shroud, as death mask, as the veil of Veronica, and so forth. We accept and even venerate these leavings, not because they look like the originals, but because they were produced by direct contact with the objects they call up. Bazin never returned to photography as a subject, but treated it as an essential string in the genetic code of cinema, a medium which is, quote, the achievement in time of photographic objectivity, end quote. That part of the genetic code contributed by photography to cinema's identity explains the virtual absence in Bazin's corpus of any discussion of animated cartoons, an image mode that shares cinema's exhibition technology, but that certainly in his day was produced by the work of human hands in distinction to the automatic images of photography. Animation constitutes a prime test case, for its recent flowering can be traced to the intersection of artistic imagination with computer algorithms. Animation serves cultural functions that are both traditional, the cartoonist imitates or distorts nature just as artists always have, and futuristic, rotoscoping and now digital processes replace photography or wildly manipulate it. In this cinema's second century, the rise of animation might spell the fall of the photographic image. This is the claim of Regis Debray's Vie et mort de l'image, a grand synthesis that Bazin would have had to contend with were he at work today. Debray posits photography, including Bazin's theories about it, as the core of the modernist period, 1820 through 1980, which followed the classical age during which oil painting held cultural power. Today, the digital has lodged itself at the heart of postmodern image culture, inhuman, cold in their perfect technical reproducibility. Digital images not only can ignore the artist, they can ignore all reality beyond the monitor. Cinema may appear to have freed itself from the artist by serving as a decal of visible reality, but by the same token, digital video has freed the image from photography's dependence on a pre-existent reality. The video world appears now utterly self-contained, auto-referential, and immediate. We live with video in our living rooms and offices. The computer or TV monitor has become a sorcerer's apprentice, a piece of furniture that takes up an immense share of our inner space and time, crowding out whatever, quote, we, end quote, might have been. On the other hand, Bazin's film spectators were led by the, quote, little flashlight of the usher moving like an uncertain comet across the night of our waking dream toward the diffuse space without shape or frontiers that surrounds the screen, end quote. In the great volume of a dark theater, the spectator gazes at and reflects upon images that relay a world that is both elsewhere and present in its visual trace. The videosphere has changed all that. No longer do we pass from the image to its referent. No longer, for instance, do law courts readily accept photographic evidence, since digitization encourages the indefinite manipulation of the image until its relation to the natural world is suspect or obliterated. Images in the videosphere have no need of a source. Everything we see may be animation. Three, what might Bazin have said of this new step in the evolution of image culture? he would surely have addressed it as a step likely to demote cinema as the medium of our time. Would he have seen it as a regression to idolatry, as Debray does, one that makes the video image prized for itself and its instant effects rather than as a double of an absent world existing elsewhere or existing somewhere outside the theater? Bazin was primed to deal with such issues. His film theory begins as an anthropology of shifting image cultures, indebted, as we have seen, to the influential ideas of Malraux and parallel with the slightly earlier notions of Walter Benjamin concerning photography's relation to the arts. And yet, unlike Debray, Malraux, Benjamin, McLaughlin, and others who make long-range speculations about the media, Bazin refused to believe that shifts in technology automatically initiates shifts in the thought and behavior of a culture. In Bazin's view, technology affects culture only after being itself triggered by something like the cultural will. His detractors in the 70s pronounced Bazin an, quote, idealist, end quote, since he seemed to posit an independent life of the spirit, one that effects material changes, including the invention of technologies. And indeed, he was interested in asking why cinema came to be invented only in the 19th century when so many of its principles were understood earlier. Bazin entertains the notion that culture must itself be cultivated by the arts in specific ways until the taste for a technology, like photography, becomes overwhelmingly enough to promote and reward inventive tinkerers. The historical research of Peter Galassi and Jacques Amant on the pre-photographic realism in paintings of the 18th and early 19th centuries, not to mention the growing cultural history of the period emphasizing the expansion of popular taste in such things as visual toys and illustrated journalism, sustained Bazin's desire to complicate the formula of change. Bazin's idealism, then, if idealist he be, is paradoxically impure, for no film theorist, except perhaps Deleuze, has been more attentive to the historical material peculiarities of the medium and its products. Both men had a penchant for taxonomy. Bazin could write, quote, the evolution of the language of cinema, end quote, only when, like Darwin, he felt completely familiar with countless species, including dominant strains, freaks, and oddities, and organisms that were dying out. For Bazin, films are suspended in a cinema culture defined by the rules and expectations of genres, so that each film can be identified by the types of regulations it serves or thwarts. In one of his most clever essays, quote, The Virtues and Limitations of Montage, end quote, Bazin applied the characteristics he identified in, quote, The Evolution of the Language of Cinema, end quote, to the minor genre of the children's film. In this case, the genre was not treated as an evolving organism, but as a constant human impulse. People of all eras and cultures have entertained children with fabulous tales. Bazin reasoned that in the cinema certain laws, or more precisely, certain limits of montage promote or defeat the effect of, quote, the marvelous, end quote, aimed at by the genre. One cannot, for the sake of eloquence or convenience, cut into the space of the marvelous without turning it into standard cinematic spectacle. While watching a conjurer work, the spectator at a live magic show stares without blinking in an effort to note the moment when reality is tricked. Where were a filmmaker to shoot the trick from multiple angles, editing it for the best view, who would be or who would believe in the magic? Question mark. Films of magic and fairy tales are two subgenres of marvelous where where rules of editing derive from a relation between psychological and aesthetic factors. Rules governing other genres follow. Some, like restrictions of shot changes in slapstick comedy, seem relatively stable across time. Others, for instance, the prohibition against reconstructed events in newsreels, are less permanent. At certain times in film history, audiences were convinced by reconstructions either because they were gullible or because reconstructions served an intermediate function between reportage and fictionalized history. Today's docudramas, which show up on television within months of the sensational issues they represent, are a contemporary example of this mixed form. However, even were we to discover all the laws of cinema that govern its more timeless, generic functions, we would scarcely have answered the driving question, quote, what is cinema, end quote, or question mark, end of quote. Moreover, we would have characterized cinema only insofar as it takes up cultural functions, fairy tales, physical comedy, that pre-existed it. When it comes to understanding what cinema has added to cultural history, Bazin is certain that only local laws prevail and that whatever cinema is, it evolves in contact with shifting cultural needs and situations. Cinema's stable photographic axiom, together with the few corollaries demanded by stable genres, interacts in myriad ways with history and does so in an evolutionary manner. And so the bulk of Bazin's reviews and essays tacitly trace this interaction. His, quote, evolution, end quote, accumulates evidence not from cinema as an abstract potential, but from the multiple species of films that have flourished and survived. The thickest branch on this evolutionary tree has grown in the United States, from the proscenium framing of the earliest films and even of slapstick to the narrative space pioneered by Griffith to the invisible, psychological motivated editing of the classic Hollywood style. European alternatives push the silent film to a level of great graphic eloquence, either through what Bazin termed deformation of, quote, the plastics of the image, end quote, in the case of German Expressionism, or through the muscular montage by which the Soviets ripped realistic images out of spatial and temporal continuity to develop strings of metaphors and other figures that permit discursive complexity. The era in which he wrote from the outset of the Second World War up to the New Wave saw an important evolution away from what he described as the efficient representation of clever scenarios and toward the carving of stories out of a deeper, thicker, more complex space. Using his intuitions about the variable ratio of space to script, Bazin traced the Darwinian struggle for survival of many species of film, often isolating conflicting impulses in a single movie, such as Mr. Hulot's Holiday. The richness of Bazin's conception of cinema stems from the interpenetration of style and matter that he so ingeniously observed and more ingeniously described in the hundreds of films he treated. Because of the photographic axiom, cinema more than the other arts adjusts itself to and is altered by the projects it is asked to take up. When the Second World War brought new material to represent, the cinema responded with an enlarged set of codes, particularly governing the documentary, and with new technologies of representation. When a trend developed after 1945 to adapt first-person novels, film noir, La Symphonie Pastorale 1946, Le Silence de la Mer 1947, and of course La Journée d'une cure de campagne 1950, sound and image relations needed to be radically readjusted to deliver subjectivity, reflection, and perception in subtle ways. Bazin became the leading theorist of these post-war developments, elaborating Alexandre Astruc's famous 1948 plea for, quote, la camera stylo, end quote, that is, for an approach to cinema as supple as a writer's approach to his or her projects. Bazin's, quote, evolution of the language of cinema, end quote, concludes by suggesting that the new realist impulse in cinema has made the filmmaker the, quote, equal of the novelist, end quote. The ability to carve stories out of complex space invites the spectator to view the world as inflected, but not utterly dominated by the consciousness of the artist. Space remains partly independent of the artist who delivers it to us. Hence, we are permitted and sometimes encouraged to look beyond the artist's organization of things to the complexity of the world, to the, quote, mystery, end quote, and, quote, ambiguity, end quote, that outlast every view of it. Cinema reveals to the anxious and alert spectator a world alive with possibilities that ask for recognition and response. In cinema, aesthetic issues lead immediately to moral ones. The values Bazin found in the cinema, including the discovery of nature, the mystery of human expressions and motivations, and fresh approaches to tired arts, derived from a personal and personalist philosophy that sustained him throughout a life of relative deprivation and constant illness. These same values would bring down on him the scorn of his opponents, few of whom could impugn the man or his mission, but many of whom needed in their eras to argue for different values and thus for a different cinema. This would be true at his own journal, Cahiers du Cinéma, which repudiated him along with his friends and admirers, Truffaut and Romer, when the monumentous events of May 1968 politicized the critical landscape in Paris. Sometimes one can best measure the strength of a thinker by the vehemence of the attacks he or she is subject to. Andre Bazin occasioned such a stream of virulent responses after 1968 that his thought must have weighed heavily on those needing to throw off that weight so as to undertake a kind of thinking proper to their generation. His opponents, who grew in number in the post-New Wave era, worked in a culture dominated by television. In noisy journals, conferences, and classrooms, they competed with other film scholars hoping to have the kind of effect on cinema that Bazin had been able to claim with such apparent ease, in what was more clearly the age of cinema. Writing before the assimilation of, quote, cinema studies, end quote, into the academy, writing without needing to display or defend his methodology, writing even before the era of the extended exegesis, his 1950 Orson Welles stands among the first monographs on a director. Bazin was the champion of those who wanted cinema to break from the stranglehold of convention. He proved to be a modest champion, but behind him rode the vainglorious knights of Cahiers du Cinema. As Serge Daney lamented jealously, quote, the generation of the new wave was certainly lucky, for they really knew how to make enemies, end quote. The post-1968 Marxists had to turn against the complacency and confidence of what was by now not the new wave, but a receding wave of critics, many of whom had become professional filmmakers. Since Bazin had given his followers such confidence, Bazin had to be taken down. Of course, not just anyone could be proclaimed champion of a cause. It required more than intelligence and an engaging style, more too than a passion for cinema. It required a specific cultural background with an attended agenda. This, as much as anything, his later critics targeted. Because it was tied to a dated discourse, Bazin's thought could be diminished by being exposed as determined. The consequences of his beliefs could be circumscribed by the historical situation that engendered them. Bazin simply had to be removed as an impediment to the post-1968 political agenda at Cahiers du Cinema, at least until that agenda in turn fell out of favor and Bazin's name could be re-invoked, often reverentially. In any case, even during its Marxist period, those in charge at Cahiers maintained much of the Bazinian heritage. This is particularly visible in the writings of Serge Daney, the most important figure after Bazin to work at this most influential film journals. Daney's criticism ever urged the, quote, morality of style, end quote. His essays on television, written in the 80s at Liberation, take up the kind of thinking about images in video culture that Bazin had brought to such a level of sophistication for cinema. Most pertinently, Daney and Bazin share an instinct and an ability to track the crucial shifts of their respective image cultures from within. By observing symptoms in the visual phenomena they so obviously love to write about, and then there is the matter of style. These men knew how to write so that the words themselves produced ideas hard as rocks, words that were dense enough, grave enough, that is, with sufficient gravity, not to float off, but to anchor a point of view, a way of thinking, a personality. Let us say it in auteur. Dudley Andrew, April 2004. This was the foreword to the 2004 edition. Introduction by Hugh Gray. It is nearly 9 years since Andre Bazin died, but the critical insight that illuminates his writings has not grown dim with the years. It continues to shine forth in its very personal way, and the arguments through which he diffused it offer a brilliant example of a combination of the critical spirit and the spirit of synthesis, each operating with equal force. Bazin's thought, while rooted in a rich cultural tradition, produces conclusions that at times are forcefully expressed in terms drawn from contemporary science, in ambivalence which contributes markedly to his style and as markedly to the problems of a translator. Scattered among allusions drawn from literature, poetry, philosophy, and religion are analogies from chemistry, electricity, geology, psychology, and physics. Indeed, there are moments when one pictures Bazin as a poet in dungarees. Then again, there are moments when one is aware of the teacher he was trained to be, was denied the opportunity to be inside the classroom, yet has succeeded in being both in France and abroad. Those who, so to speak, had the good fortune to sit at his feet tell us that what remains on paper is but a fragment of his wondrous discourse. Andre Bazin was born on April 18, 1918, at Angers. He received his early schooling at La Rochelle, where he was taken at the age of 5. Destined for the teaching profession, he entered training college first at La Rochelle and subsequently studied at Versailles. Then, in 1938, he transferred to the École Normale Supérieure at St. Cloud. He completed his studies there with a brilliant qualifying examination, but because of a stammer, was eventually refused a teaching post. His intense interest in films seems to date from his early days in the army, to which he was called in 1939. Guy Ledger, his then companion in arms, recounts that from the very outset Bazin tended to center his interest on speculative questions relating to film. Quote, he was already attracted to the study of the true value of the cinematographic image, as well as to the historical and social aspects of cinema. At that time, when the world seemed to be going to extremes in another direction, we turned to motion pictures as an escape from the quote phony war, end quote, end of quote. What Guy Ledger here says concerning their common interest is a foreshadowing of what was repeated constantly throughout the years by everyone who knew and shared his interest in the cinema. Quote, what had been for me up to then only a pastime, now began to appear under the tutelage of Andre, a product of the age of the image, something that needed study if one was to savor its true flavor and understand its real significance, to make out its true language, and to discover its objective laws. Another friend, the critic P.A. Touchard, said of him early in their acquaintance that he found Bazin deeply impressive not only for his charm and his generosity of spirit, but for his prodigious capacity for critical analysis as well as for the intense poetic sensibility. Quote, no one, end quote, says Touchard, quote, had a greater command of words than this man who stammered when he spoke, and who had likewise a fantastic appetite for the consumption of scientific, philosophical, and abstract terms. Yet he was in no sense a pedant, remaining ever in command of the appropriate use of all these terms, end quote. During the war, he was a member of an organization, the Maison des Lettres, which was founded to take care of young students whose regular scholastic routine the war had disturbed. There, he founded a Ciné Club, which developed out of meetings at which he defied the Nazi forces of occupation in the Vichy government by showing films they had banned for political reasons. His passion for the cinema, we are told and can readily believe, was part of his passion for culture and truth, allied to a moral authority which gave him the command over others that he exercised over himself, not only throughout a long inner spiritual conflict, but also throughout a lifelong heroic struggle with the disease that was to take him off at the height of his intellectual powers. It has indeed been said that he was something of a mystic, although one would rather incline to think of him instead as a poet very much of his time. Always, too, there was in him that capacity characteristic of great teachers to bring out what was best in others, well described by Touchard as a, quote, Socratic capacity to make those who talked to him seem intelligent to themselves, end quote. Indeed, one might call him the Aristotle of the cinema, and his writing is poetics. At the end of the occupation, he was appointed film critic of La Parisienne Libérée. Thus began his formal life as a public critic, and with it the development of a type of reviewing of films the like of which had not up to then existed. One of his singular achievements was to be able, without any concessions to popularizing, to make his insights understood on all levels. It was said of him at the time that in 10 years he would become the outstanding French film critic. It took him less time than that. To us, his most commonly known association is with Les Cahiers du Cinéma, which under his direction became one of the world's most distinguished film publications. Meanwhile, his other film activities multiplied. among them an appointment as Director of Cultural Services at the Institut des Hautes Études Cinématographiques. He was thus appointed to a school at last, at a time when the word filmology, now well established, did not exist. Quote, by his own efforts, Bazin created, end quote, says Jean-Louis Tellier, quote, a cinematographic culture, end quote. Nor can one adequately estimate the actual effect of his work on the cinema itself. Quote, Andre staggered me, end quote. Tellier continues, quote, at this time by his knowledge of a subject which one day, all unsuspected by us, would become a veritable discipline to be admitted into the halls of the Sorbonne, end quote. Tellier is here referring to the Institute of Filmology as it came to be known, the philosophy of which was first set forth by Cohen Sayat in his Essai sur les Principes d'une philosophie du cinéma, 1958. To those who hold that the intellect, as represented in the works of Bazin, divides man from his fellows and separates him off from the world, one need only offer the verdict of a man who knew Bazin intimately. Andrea Struck, quote, this theoretician, this intellectual, this idealist, this believer was considerably closer to the realities of life and to his fellow man than those who reject the approach to life of a Bazin, end quote. Francois Truffaut, whom he befriended and whom he helped, quote, probably more than anyone else, end quote, found that even to be scolded by Bazin was a delight. Quote, such a heat did he generate in his rare moments of indignation. When it was over, one never said, quote, how was I wrong? Or how wrong I was, end quote. Only, quote, how right he is, exclamation point. How terrific, exclamation point, end quote, end of quote. Robert Bresson, as usual highly perceptive, points out a marked characteristic of Bazin's method. Quote, he had a curious way of taking off from what was false to arrive ultimately at what was true, end quote. In a sense, he was following in this, possibly quite deliberately, the old scholastic method, to state the thesis and to follow the statement with a denial before proceeding to the proof. However you see it, each essay is virtually a scientific demonstration. As Eric Romer points out in his assessment of the first volume of Qu'est-ce que la cinéma, question mark, quote, these pages, each relating to an individual case, are nevertheless part of the unfolding of a methodical plan which is now revealed to us, nor is there the slightest doubt but that it was so conceived from the beginning, rather than being the outcome of a series of afterthoughts, while logic, in his unfolding rather than chronology, is his aim. It is strangely significant that the volume opens with an article on the ontology of the photographic image, which is one of his earliest pieces. It is this scientific aspect of his work that I would like to dwell on without underestimating the art of it, end quote, Romer says. Quote, each essay, and indeed the whole work itself, fits perfectly into the pattern of a mathematical demonstration. Without any doubt, the whole body of Bazin's work is based on one central idea, an affirmation of the objectivity of the cinema in the same way as all geometry is centered on the properties of a straight line. Nor does he attempt to fit his basic principles at all costs into some alien system of aesthetics. They derive solely from his own thinking. The system followed by critics before him was usually to start with a definition of art and then try and see how film fitted into it. Bazin rejects all the commonly accepted notions and proposes a radical change of perspective. End of quote. Many might expect that this quote theoretician, end quote, this quote intellectual, end quote, would be among those who deplore the passing of the silent film as the coming to an end of an art. Not so. For him, sound came not to destroy, but to fulfill the testament of cinema. This is the position that follows directly from his central theme of the objectivity of cinema and leads him to reject, at least by implication, those who in the middle 20s were in search of pure cinema, or as Sadal calls it, quote, the myth of pure cinema, end quote. Hence, his preoccupation with adaptation as it relates both to theater and to the novel, and indeed to the relation between cinema and painting. No one, to my knowledge, has challenged Bazin's stature as a critic, but some other critics have had their moments of disagreement with him. Notable among these is Jean Mintry, another respected figure in the realm of film history and aesthetics, whose 2-volume study, Esthétique et Psychologie du Cinéma, has recently appeared. Although throughout this work he praises Bazin more often than he condemns him, he does in fact challenge, and by no means altogether unjustifiably, it would seem to me, the central concept of Bazin's critical structure, namely the objective reality of the filmic language, as well as Bazin's arguments on deep focus photography. The reader will see how often this use of cinema is referred to, and in how many contexts, from a discussion of the films of Renoir to an examination of the true role of montage. In, quote, the evolution of the language of cinema, end quote, Bazin speaks of the image as being evaluated not according to what it adds to reality, but what it reveals of it. This Mintry challenges, refusing to accept the argument that because the camera automatically registers a given, quote, reality, end quote, it gives us an objective and impartial image of that reality. What the camera reveals, Mintry argues, is not the reality in itself, but a new appearance correlated to the world of things, what indeed one may call a camera perception, which, irrespective of the will of the cameraman, produces a certain, quote, segregation of space, end quote, that is to say, a restructuring of the real so that it can no longer be considered, quote, objective and immediate. It is likewise on his theory of film objectivity that Bazin bases his refusal to agree that the essence of theater resides, as Henry Gohier puts it, in the physical presence of the actor, thus setting it apart from the cinema in one very basic respect. As a corollary of this famed argument, Bazin holds that the cinematic image is more than a reproduction. Rather, it is a thing in nature, a mold or mask. It is in this area that I myself find him difficult to follow. Here, for once perhaps, he goes beyond the realm of fact into the brilliantly created world of the, quote, ben trovato, end quote. Of his exuberant enthusiasm for the cinema, however, no better expression is to be found than his description of the film brought back from the Kon-Tiki expedition. The style of it is quintessential Bazin, but while there is the ubiquitous paradox, for once no scientific terms are pressed into service. One feels so clearly in reading it the vivid presence of the raft, the, quote, flotsam, end quote, against which the fauna of the Pacific rub shoulders, their actions recorded in a film, quote, snatched from the tempest, end quote, a photographic record not so much of things, but of the danger which the camera shared. A film whose very faults are witness to its authenticity. If I were asked to name the most perfectly wrought piece of film criticism that I have ever read, I would unhesitatingly name the essay on the style of Robert Bresson. Furthermore, this essay contains what for me is an unforgettable summing up of the adaptation of a novel to the screen, concerning the way Bresson handled Jacques Le Fataliste, the novel from which Les Dames du Bois de Boulogne was derived. Bazin writes, quote, the sound of a windshield wiper against a page of Diderot is all it took to turn it into Racinian dialogue, end quote. To this phrase, I would apply the one Bazin used to describe his own delight in the work of Charlie Chaplin. In reading it, one experiences, quote, the delight of recognizing perfection, end quote. Today, at last, due in no small part to Andre Bazin, the cinema is being widely recognized as a serious and important field of study. Too many, for too long, notably in the United States, have preferred to think of it simply as an avenue of escape par excellence from a high-pressure life for which we are ever seeking, a new world, as it were, to live in. But such so-called paths of escape, pleasant as they are to wander in, are in reality each but a cul-de-sac. The more we see the screen as a mirror rather than an escape hatch, the more we will be prepared for what it has, or for what is to come. Automation, we are told, will wipe the sweat from the brow and straighten the back of an atom hitherto condemned to labor. Then will come the ultimate confrontation that man has so long avoided on the grounds that he must first live before he can philosophize. The cinema is capable, in the right hands, of playing an increasingly important role in this confrontation, for helping us to understand how or why this can be so. Andre Bazin may rightly be acclaimed a true visionary and guide. Supremely, he is one of the few who have genuinely helped to answer the question first asked by Canudo, Deluc, and the other pioneers of film aesthetics and filmology. What is cinema? Those of us who in his footsteps are likewise concerned to answer this question, and who must therefore reach out as he did beyond the screen to the realms of history, philosophy, literature, psychology, sociology in search of the answer, and in the process add another dimension to the humanities, are particularly in the debt of this preceptor. And now I have certain other debts to pay. First of all, to Madame Janine Bazin, who in every negotiation concerned with this undertaking has been graciousness itself. In addition, I wish to acknowledge that without the generous help of Jean Renoir, of whose genius Bazin was an ardent and outspoken admirer, and of my colleagues, Doctors Madeleine Carral and Gabriel Bono, I would not have been able to render many difficult passages into English. I am grateful also to one of my students, Senor Markowitz of the Argentine, who assisted me in comparing my English with the Spanish translation. Finally, I am also deeply indebted to the special number of Cahiers du Cinema dedicated to Andre Bazin for the facts and impressions there recorded by his friends. And I was reading the introduction to What is Cinema? Essays selected and translated by Hugh Gray. What is Cinema? Volume 2 by Andre Bazin. Foreword by Jean Renoir. New foreword by Dudley Andrew. Essays selected and translated by Hugh Gray.